Startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Castor.
And I'm Kaitlyn Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by mug.news. Don Macke has been contributing to the entrepreneurship community since 2001, when he co-founded and co-directed what was previously known as the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship and is now titled E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, hosted by Network Kansas. Currently, he's vice president of E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, where he focuses on entrepreneur-led economic development strategies for ecosystem communities. Don, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So I figured we could just dive right in.
You bet.
All right. So my first question was, how did you become involved in the startup and entrepreneurship community?
So it really goes back a number of years. I was at that time working for Governor Nelson here in Nebraska in economic development. I led the Rural Development Commission. And we felt like we had gotten a lot of good answers to support community development, but did not feel we really had good answers for economic development. How do we create a more diverse economy in rural Nebraska? That led me to get interested in entrepreneurship. Ironically, I grew up in a family of small business owners. There were 7 brothers. They all had businesses, and so I was kind of immersed in it. But it was really in the 1990s that I began to seriously consider entrepreneurship as a path forward for most rural communities. And then, as you said, by the early 2000s, that really became a focus of our work.
Absolutely. So, no, that's fascinating that you have like a lot of insider knowledge since you've been exposed to it since childhood, for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was just part of the way we grew up. Our families had various kinds of businesses from grocery stores. My parents had a gas station and garage business most of their lives. And so I saw small business operate, very up close. So yeah, it's kind of neat that I've come back and this has become the focus of my work. At least, that's one of the segments of the entrepreneurial continuum.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So then in your experience, where's a good place to start when considering building an ecosystem?
Well, we're, of course, organized around community-centered entrepreneurship. So there's always a specific place, a specific community that is trying to create a better economy, and they've, for whatever reason, decided that entrepreneurship is the way to go. And so in our, what we call our E2 development framework, it really begins with community readiness. And this isn't something we necessarily do. It's something we do with the community to help them really assess, are they ready to make the commitment to go down this road? And that's important in rural communities because oftentimes their capacity is more limited compared to larger places. And failure has a real deep toll. So readiness is the first step. And then as we kind of continue through the development framework, getting organized. One of the neat things about entrepreneurship compared to traditional development, if we were to define that as business attraction, various organizations and communities can collaborate together. Where in a more competitive environment, they're not able to do that because they're trying to win that plant or business. And so getting organized and part of that is who are the stakeholder groups in the community? Maybe there's a community college, the city, the county, the chamber, the development corp, and they come together to say, okay, how do we build a strategy and start building an ecosystem or building on the ecosystem they have? And then we have 3 assessments in our framework that we use. One is helping a community discover its entrepreneurial talent. What are the relevant resources they have both locally, but that they can get to? And what are some of the broader development opportunities in their area? And when they do that, it's pretty easy then to begin to set a strategy and start reaching out to entrepreneurs, and really a real basic transaction. Build a relationship with your entrepreneurs, find out what they need, and see if you can help network them to resources. And in doing that, you're going to discover what you need in your ecosystem. Where are your strengths, where are your weaknesses, and how do you begin to fill those gaps? It's just kind of a smart strategy because most of our communities are pretty lean in terms of their resources. And so they have to take that smart approach to building out their support system.
Absolutely. So it looks like doing your research, paying attention, and if you follow that first step and do it correctly, the following step, what would you say are like some key features that make a successful ecosystem after you've done the first step?
Well, I think part of it, what we've discovered is, in many cases, we're dealing with communities that have gone through chronic and severe distress. If it's in my part of the country, the Great Plains, it's loss of population. If you're in the industrial Midwest, maybe it's high unemployment or underemployment. If you're in the South, it's maybe poverty. And so it's really critical that the community, from the time it decides to start down this road, or maybe they've been doing it for a while and they really want to up their game, is to get to some meaningful progress. And typically we suggest that needs to occur within a year, because what often happens is, a group of stakeholders like the chamber and the city will come together, put some money into the initiative. But if it doesn't appear that it's making progress by the time the next funding cycle comes up, then that community will maybe move on to something else. And so our whole framework is geared to, from the time they say, we're going to do this, get organized, do those assessments, commit to a strategy, and within 6 months actually begin working with entrepreneurs. Because what that means then is they've got that back half of the year to demonstrate some impact, stories, maybe some metrics, and that then tends to allow the community to feel much more comfortable about saying, we're going to stay with this strategy, we're going to invest more in this strategy. Maybe other partners come in and provide further capital and staffing support. That becomes really critical. And so based on our experience, if communities don't kind of get to that point within a year and a half, then they tend to lose energy, lose momentum, and the strategy eventually disappears.
Definitely. Yeah. So it just makes a lot of sense to try and keep the ball rolling, because I've heard this phrase quite a bit, where it's easy to start something, but it's that continuing to follow through that sometimes gets a bit tricky. So then it seems like with a stronger ecosystem, you can keep the momentum going based on your advice.
Yeah, the sooner we can actually get to doing economic development, and by that I mean exercising the ecosystem to connect entrepreneurs with resources, and that allows those entrepreneurial ventures to move forward, whether that's a startup, a transition, or an existing business that wants to grow. That then really begins to demonstrate to the community, but also to other entrepreneurs, that this community can actually help them. And that becomes important in terms of sustaining the effort and empowering it to grow out to its fuller potential.
Absolutely. So then potentially if someone came into an ecosystem and sees that it needs some improvement, how would you recommend that they build a stronger ecosystem? What are some things they can do?
Yeah, well, part of it is we take this market demand approach. By working with entrepreneurs, we're going to identify what are the gaps in the system. And so that's really important, because that's kind of an efficiency and an effectiveness strategy that says, we're not going to build out everything that we could because we don't have the resources to do that. But if we discover that we really need LLC angel investors, that's going to allow younger people who maybe don't have the equity or the credit rating to get into business to do so, then that becomes pretty obvious as you begin to work with those entrepreneurs. And what happens is that generates kind of a priority list of gaps in the ecosystem that now the community or the region can focus on, saying, okay, how can we fill those gaps? Is there a resource we can connect to that bring into the community? Is there something we need to build locally? Or like with the LLC investors, maybe we're going to look around our larger region and find communities that have those kinds of angel investment networks, learn from them how to do it so that we can get it started in our community. It just allows you to really focus smartly, but again, driven by the needs of the entrepreneurs that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So then it seems like, so this is an influx of a lot of information, and it's hard to remember everything too when you're beginning out and starting ecosystem building. But what would you say are the most common mistakes when trying to build an ecosystem, kind of the don'ts that they wouldn't think of that they're doing?
Well, I think first of all is readiness, is really making sure, and we've got some readiness tools that we work with communities on to determine, is there enough right stuff? Is it the right time for this community to move forward? Because if there's kind of a casual commitment, or maybe there's a small group that's committed, but the rest of the community's not on board, it's going to be much harder. So that's one mistake. I think the second mistake really goes back to what we were talking about before, and that is what we call the supply side approach. Thinking about the ecosystem as this checklist of things you should have in your community. And just because one community might have an incubator or an accelerator or has been pursuing a linkage to a venture fund, that doesn't necessarily mean that those parts of an ecosystem are relevant to the entrepreneurs in your community. And that's why we go back to that demand-driven approach. But part of the habit of communities is to simply kind of mimic what other successful communities have done, which is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the right solutions for your community. And so that's a big mistake, because if all the energy goes into, say, an incubator in a small rural community, then the community may never actually get to the work of reaching out to entrepreneurs, finding out what they need, and networking them to resources. All the energy just gets sucked up into that real estate project, and then there's no customers. And that creates a failure, and that can then create negative energy in the community to say, okay, we tried entrepreneurship, it didn't work. And so, that's a problem. The third thing I would mention is, in some communities, there is this belief that they don't have any entrepreneurial talent. Because again, when you use the word entrepreneur, people have different ideas come to mind as to what that means. I mean, some people think of, Bill Gates, or they think of a mom and pop hardware store and everything in between. And so within our framework, it's helping the community understand there's a continuum of entrepreneurial talent. And while you may have less high growth entrepreneurial talent in a rural community, you've got other kinds of entrepreneurial talent that you can support. So really helping the community get past the idea that there's no opportunity there, that there is. And we got to understand what it looks like and then focus our resources on helping it become more successful.
Absolutely. And then I feel like that definitely comes in with like one of your first steps, which is researching the community and just taking that observation time as well.
Yeah. And that's what our 3 assessments are about. They're kind of these frameworks for the community to really, number 1, understand the entrepreneurial talent they have. Number 2, what kinds of resources can they bring to bear? And then number 3, really understanding their larger economic opportunities. So if, some of the communities we've been working with in Central Appalachia, Recreational tourism has really taken off. If you think about it, parts of Appalachian Kentucky are very close to nearly 50 million people who are looking to escape the cities. And so huge entrepreneurial opportunities in communities that offer amazing biking and hiking trails, rivers to raft, other experiences. That would be examples of that third opportunity of really looking at, are there broader development areas that we can connect to that would allow us to grow out parts of our entrepreneurial talent and opportunity.
Definitely. You're making me remember one of these towns that I used to visit. So it's Lanesboro, Minnesota. And it
Uh-huh.
was, yeah, have you ever been or have you heard
I'm
of it?
familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think about it as that as a entrepreneurship thing, but it's definitely, like you said, there's the biking, there's the escaping the big city. That's definitely like an example of a huge opportunity area.
Yeah. And in most communities, these things are intuitive. People know they're there, but it helps to do the research to step back and say, you could really diversify your economy. And so going back to the Appalachian Kentucky case, most of these counties had lots of assets that where people could do things and they wanted to do things, but they didn't have lodging.
Mhm.
And so the focus really was on bed and breakfast development, which a lot of people wanted to do as a way to supplement or create an income. And so we've got examples of counties that went from maybe one or two B&Bs to over 100. And of course, the longer you can keep those visitors in the county, staying in the county, the greater the spending, the greater the economic development impact. So the whole focus was, how do you help these B&B owner and operators become the best entrepreneurs in that space that they can be? So, I mean, that really created a sharp focus for where they needed to build out their ecosystem today.
Mhm. Definitely. So you mentioned diversity. So basically, diversity in an ecosystem is important to encourage growth.
Yep.
What are some ways that diversity can be reached within one's own ecosystem?
Well, it's interesting you raise that because we're actually working on a paper on that right now, kind of defining the importance of diversity in entrepreneurship. And I think one way to think about it is, if you're going to optimize an entrepreneur-led development strategy, you really want to embrace the full diversity of the human talent in your community. And every community has at least subtle bias, in some cases, deliberate bias. And in rural communities, it could be based on race or immigrants or refugees, or it could be as simple as a bias against new residents. Or, for example, in the community where I grew up, if you came from quote unquote a good family, we would support you. If you came from a family with a checkered history, you may not get support. And so part of it is the community moving past that and saying, if this person has drive, they've got a reasonable idea, are we going to create equal opportunity for them to give it a go? And that may mean some additional assistance. So, if you've got people on the margin and they don't quite have a good credit record, well, how do you help them rebuild that credit record, maybe with character-based lending or equity investments? And that really unleashes the full dimensions of talent in the community. And we think that's hugely important in the case studies we've done, where communities have kind of moved past those areas of bias of saying, who should we support and who shouldn't we support? Um, that restricts you. And then the other thing is, when you really embrace the full range of entrepreneurial talent, all of a sudden the players in the ecosystem begin to reflect the diversity of the community. And so you even get a deeper understanding of what it takes to support certain kinds of entrepreneurs who are at different stages in both their personal and venture development. Where you're just going to get more impact, but you're also going to build a better community that has equal opportunity and greater inclusion, which I also think makes for a better community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I can make some personal connections as well with being from a small town in addition.
Yeah.
And then I actually just recently moved to Texas. And one of my observations has been everyone is very kind here. But one of the observations I've made, it's like, oh, everyone's moving here. And
Yep.
mixed reviews. Like some people, they made it as an observation. And then some people maybe weren't super happy about it. But I think that is a good opportunity, though, because you might have an outsider's perspective and potentially how to grow. Mm-hmm.
Well, and also chances are with, say, new residents who move into a community, they may have an idea that has never been tried in that community, and so it's kind of foreign. Is the community willing to give it a chance? I mean, a great example is Allo Communications, a fast-growing telephony company, started in a community of 2,000 in western Nebraska. It was a big stretch for the local community to provide initial capitalization to those entrepreneurs to say, we're going to take on big telephone and we're going to be successful. And the neat thing is it's one of the fastest growing telephony companies in our part of the country right now. It's in the Lincoln and Omaha market. It's getting ready to grow into other major cities like Kansas City and Des Moines. But it would have been very easy for folks to say, okay, these folks are crazy, that can't be done here. And maybe it can't, but you've got to give it a chance, give it a fair opportunity. And if they can prove up, are you willing to support it as a community through your ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So then through your involvement and through your time in the community, what would you say is one misconception that you've heard about either startups, ecosystems, or entrepreneurship?
Well, we kind of touched on it. I think part of it is how we define entrepreneurs. And that's why we use the term entrepreneurial talent and really frame it as a continuum of talent from, those that are aspiring startup all the way to high growth, really kind of taking away those perceptional definitions that people have and understanding that with each of those segments, we have a pretty well-established typology of entrepreneurial talent that we use with communities, which each of those, they have different development needs. So, historically, when we worked with entrepreneurs, the thing we wanted to do is bring them into a workshop and teach them how to be an entrepreneur. Well, if you're in a business that's been in existence for 2 generations and now you want to grow, you're not necessarily going to go to a workshop. You want somebody to work with you on growth planning. And so helping communities understand that depending on who they're working with and where they're at developmentally within that continuum requires different approaches, different capital, different market research, different technical assistance. And that really helps begin to order the ecosystem to say, okay, we don't have a lot of growth entrepreneurs. You think about a community where I went to high school in, with, a county with 6,000 people, there's a handful of growth-oriented entrepreneurs in that county at any given time. But there are resources within the region that are relevant to what they're doing. And so, again, that allows your community to say, how do we connect to those resources in turn to support that segment of our entrepreneurial talent? So I think that's the biggest challenge. And then the second is defining community. We tend to define community along traditional legal lines, the municipality, the county. And the fact is, almost all of these communities are much larger. They're socioeconomic communities where based on commuting and shopping patterns, they're bigger. Which means, are you collaborating with area communities to build your ecosystem, realizing that the people you're ultimately going to support come from a much larger geography than your legal boundaries. And that becomes important because oftentimes the tools we use to fund this may be a local option sales tax that a city passes, and the law says, you can only spend those dollars on businesses in your town, yet you really do want to support businesses throughout your region, because if they're thriving, they're going to contribute to the vitality of your community. So those would be a couple examples of things that we encourage people to think about, really understand that continuum of entrepreneurial talent and what specific segments need, and then taking a broader look at defining your community.
Certainly. So then, are there any news outlets, podcasts, or blogs that are dedicated to cover startups? Would you recommend any?
Well, we're starting to see a lot more. Our friends at Frank and Kimberly Spillers out of Atlantic, Iowa, are doing both rural TV and podcasts, which we can sure make that information available to you. We're just starting a podcast, and we launched this week that will focus on rural entrepreneurship. But it's really interesting, since we entered into the podcast world, how many folks have now reached out to us saying we're starting to do that as well. Maybe not just rural, but in the entrepreneurship space. And so we're going to start curating a list of those resources so that we can make those available to our network of learners that we've developed over the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, it's really great that we were able to connect as well via podcast as well.
Yeah, exactly. See, I didn't know that you were doing this, and you are, and so you're now on our radar screen, and hopefully we can promote what you're doing. Obviously, the work of the UN Marion Kaufman Foundation is kind of creating a way for a lot of people to connect in this space and get networked to each other. So I would really encourage folks, if they're not following what the Kaufman Foundation is doing, to do that. Just get up on their website. It's easy to connect. They've got a number of initiatives that you can become part of. The other thing is something called Rural Rise, which the Kaufman Foundation has supported, but there's a lot of other groups. And Rural Rise focuses more specifically on rural entrepreneurship, and it's a great network. We encourage people to become members of that because that'll kind of get them connected, if they happen to be in the rural space, to more relevant rural resources and networks.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for meeting with me. But do you have any final thoughts or advice that you would give as a parting?
Yeah, I would just share, for better or for worse, I've been in the community economic development game for a long time. And I really have come to believe that entrepreneurship is foundational to community economic success, but also the social success of communities. Communities change, I think, for the better. And this is based on our case study work. When they become more entrepreneurial, they're more open to change and opportunity, collaborative efforts. And, I would encourage folks to look at the growing number of stories, case studies, and books that are capturing this experience. I think it would be inspirational that you may be struggling right now or have been struggling for a long time. These could help you and your community become convinced that going down this road is really critical to your success, and there's help out there that can help you do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, and then we'll be sure to have some of those links in our episode notes as well. So thank you
Sounds
so
great.
much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, it's my pleasure and my best with your podcast as you move forward.
Thank you so much.
Now that we've learned about an ecosystem from a person who's building it, I'm going to link back up with Nick to clarify on some jargon and take a deeper dive into this ecosystem.
So, Kaitlyn, how was your interview with Don?
I had a great time. We really connected on a ton of stuff. He had a lot of information regarding entrepreneurship. He was already involved in like business since he was like younger, because a lot of his family members were business owners. So I found that like was a cool take. I hadn't interviewed anyone yet who was already involved in this before they got started. So that was like a cool takeaway at the beginning. So.
Yes, yeah, it's always interesting to see people's family history and then how that relates to what they end up doing. Sometimes there's a loose correlation, like other times there's none, but a lot of times there is something where your grandfather was an entrepreneur or something like that. So yes.
Yeah, that was, and one of the things, because for me so far, I have just interviewed people who kind of stumbled into it or didn't realize they were in it until a couple years, because the definition of ecosystem builder wasn't like quite a thing yet. So this was just my first notice that this is the first time I've interviewed someone who was already ingrained in it. So.
Yes, yeah, most definitely. How jargony was he? Was there anything you had to look up after?
Not necessarily look up after, but like another takeaway that I had from it was like, I'm just looking at my notes again. He covered a lot of material and it was amazing. But a big takeaway that I had from it is when you are building your ecosystem, you need to look at what the resources already are present, looking at what entrepreneurs, what the startup community actually needs from you, rather than being an outside source coming in and assuming you know exactly what the community needs. So taking a step back and observing your surroundings. So that was fascinating that he brought up that point.
Yes, yeah, and it's like the classic savior complex of like, oh, I know so much, I'm going to come in and immediately help you all, instead of like understanding their needs and wants and what they're trying to do, and then align the goals. Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely. Any closing out thoughts, Kaitlyn?
Yeah, let me check my last notes. But I guess one of the last things that really stood out to me is thinking outside the box. We talked about Lanesboro, which is a amazing small town in Minnesota. And I had not thought about the opportunity there with bed and breakfasts. We went over that point. And I thought that was such a great point, thinking of, even though it's a small town, there's so much opportunity. So that's my last minute thoughts. Nick, do you want to read us out?
Of course. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ecosystem Builder Podcast, which is a product of mug.news and hosted by myself, Nick Kastner, and my co-host, Kaitlyn Clays. I'm sorry about the text message. That was from my mother. If you have any questions about today's episode, connect with us on Twitter at Nick Kastner, at Clays Creates, or at Mug.news Official. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share it with your friends. We release episodes every single Wednesday morning. Gosh darn it, Mom. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a beat.